It feels like mystery, but it's all a part of God's great history.
No great but Christ.
This was my best decision.
This is my life.
My love grows deeper with age. We've got a book of history. Now we can turn the
Great but
page.
Christ. This was my best decision. My life.
Hello and welcome to Disciples History Podcast. I am Rick Lowry, president of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society, and I am just thrilled today to have as my guest on this podcast my friend Dr. Timothy Lee, who is associate professor of History of Christianity and director of the Asian American and Pacific Islander Church Studies program at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. He's an ordained Disciples of Christ minister, and among the many degrees that he has, he earned his PhD at the University of Chicago, and he has served in a variety of leadership roles in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, including a period of service on the board of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. In many ways, most significantly served as second vice moderator of the church in the U.S. and Canada, and was moderator of NAPAD's inaugural board of directors. He served on Reconciliation Ministries board, Higher Education and Leadership Ministries, was on the Mission Alignment Coordinating Council that arose during my wife's tenure as general minister and president. He has served on the board of the Council on Christian Unity, and he and I have known each other for quite some time as fellow members and officers of various sorts at various points of the Association of Disciples for Theological Discussion. So, all of that impressive list of accomplishments and titles. Welcome, Tim. So glad that you're here with us.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's a great honor to be on this program and talk about our church history with you.
Well, let's just jump right into it. What I would like to do is to begin by just asking a very generic, general question of you, which is, how might we characterize the history of Asian Americans in the Disciples of Christ?
I would say we should characterize it as a kind of confluence of two streams of history. And by that I mean we had two distinct developments that kind of came together to form what it is NAPE and North American Pacific Asian Disciples today. And the first stream originates way back in the late 19th century when the first Asian disciple community was formed in 1891. And that beginning kind of unfolded throughout the early part of the 20th century, and we can go more about this later by discussing more specific questions. And then, in the 20th century, a lot of things happened in this country and the entire world. A lot of it was not very good, not very good for minoritized folks in the United States in particular. So there were a great deal of hardships experienced by Asian disciple communities in the first half of the 20th century. So by the end of the first half of the 20th century, like 1950 or so, there really was only one disciple community left. Throughout, there were 9 altogether in our history in the first half. despite all the difficulties, there were 9 really important Asian disciple communities. But by 1950, there was only 1. So that stream exists today, mainly in the form of Filipino Christian Church, but that wasn't the found of the community that we are now today, which NAPAD is now comprising over 100 various congregations, and that second stream comes from an effort by disciples leadership in the latter half of the 20th century, in the late 1970s, when a group of disciple leaders led by Harold Johnson and David Kagiwara and Sunguk Choi deliberately began to form a community of disciples who were of Asian descent. And that led to a series of development, again, which we can talk more specifically about each of these developments that eventuated in the formation of NAPAD in 1996, and eventually a distinct unit of the General Church as executive pastor of NAPAD. Current Reverend Chung Sung Kim serves in that position. So these two streams come together to form the history of NAPAD, and each of the streams is quite interesting in the way it unfolded, with a lot of fascinating characters involved.
Further down in our conversation, we can talk more specifically about NAPAD and kind of what gave rise to the formation of this particular ministry within our church. But I do want, because I want people who may not be familiar with our disciples alphabet soup, I just want to underline again what the name of the organization is that is signified by this acronym of NAPAD. Could you just tell us what does NAPAD mean?
Okay, that's a very good question. NAPAD means North, NAPAD, North American Pacific Islander Disciples. And that wasn't the original name for our community. Again, this is part of the development of the second stream in 1978, when Harold Johnson, who was an executive in the disciple home missions, he was in charge of missions programs, and he, in 1978, formed an informal group of disciples that were interested in forming a distinct disciple community. And so they met in 1978, and after the end of meeting, they decided to call themselves Fellowship of Asian American Disciples. So it came to be known as FAD. And then in the following year, they had another meeting, and this was, an important meeting because it involved some key figures like David Kagiwara. And they decided to rename themselves American Asian Disciples, not Asian American Disciples, but American Asian Disciples. And this idea was presented to the group by Itako Maeda, who was a Japanese American,
yes,
who served many years as a missionary in South America, Brazil in particular. And at that time, she was retired and was involved with the work of forming this Asian disciple congregation of community with Harold Johnson. So she suggested that that since American government designates people who live in the United States as Asian American, and since the group is seeking a more expansive understanding of Asian community, one that embraces not only people living in the United States, but of course in Canada, because
Right.
our denomination encompasses folks in
Right.
Canada, but
Right.
also in South America. So she suggested that they call themselves American Asian disciples, and American to mean the both continents.
Right.
So
Both.
that was accepted, and that's how the name was identified for the Asian disciples in the community, and they hoped that they would catch on, and other folks in the denomination would understand what they were trying to do. But of course, that was hard because they were going against a very established understanding of
Right.
what AA meant, Asian American, right?
Right.
So finally, they decided in 1996, and there were some other factors involved here as well. By that time, in the denomination at large, there were concerns about not incorporating Canadian disciples into our more explicit understanding of who we are.
Right.
And there were also desire on the part of a lot of Asian disciples that we need to be more explicit about identifying ourselves with Pacific Islanders who are in the minority in terms of numbers, but were still a significant presence. So there was some discussions about that, and finally a new name was introduced, North American Pacific Asian Disciples, NAPAD, and so that was adopted at the convocation of the community in 1996. So since then, we've called ourselves NAPAD.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay.
And the Pacific Islander part of it, there's really kind of a thriving Tongan community
Right,
on the other side, I guess in Utah,
right.
and Samoan
Samoan.
community. So there really is just a rich kind of culture among our disciples' fellowship of these Pacific Islander communities. This conversation really raises for me the question that we're posing at the conference that the Disciples of Christ Historical Society is sponsoring March 18th and 19th at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's a Kirkpatrick academic conference on systemic racism, anti-racism, and reconciliation in our shared history and tradition. And Tim was both on the focus group and in many ways the idea for this conference came from comments that Tim made in this Disciples of Christ Historical Society gathered focus group. So in many ways, to my way of thinking, Tim is sort of the progenitor of the whole idea of this conference. But Tim will be one of our presenters at this conference. He has been very much part of the planning for this conference, for which we are eternally grateful. But this raises for me the question that we raise in this conference, that we seek to raise in this conference, which is, how has racism and this destructive ideology of white supremacy that is so much a part of our history and culture, how did racism affect Asian American disciples?
Thank you for that question. And the short answer is devastatingly, and in a literal way. And this is not only for disciples. When you actually look through the history of Asian Americans in the first half of the 20th century, what happened to the disciples, Asians, is pretty much symptomatic of what happened to Asian American Christians, all over the country. And we have um, two particular communities. We before 1945, we had three Asian ethnic church communities that were disciple: Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. And the first one was Chinese. It started, as I said, in 1891, and it started in Oregon, uh, Portland, Oregon, and there was time when Chinese in the West Coast were under a lot of harassment, and there were socioeconomic reasons lie behind it. As you may know, Rick, Chinese arrived in large numbers in the States beginning in the 1830s, first in response to labor needs in Hawaii sugar plantation, and then in 1849 when gold was discovered on the West Coast, a lot of Chinese went there as miners, and then when Continental Railroad was being laid, Chinese laborers were recruited to lay the tracks for the western part of that railroad. And the railroad was completed in 1869, and our mines, had been by that time basically exhausted, and so economically the West Coast was undergoing some difficulties, and these Chinese laborers were basically uh, left to fend for themselves, and by the time a lot of Irish immigrants had come in, many of them from very poor working class, and they were competing for jobs with these Chinese, and there weren't a lot of jobs around that time, and so a lot of anti-foreign xenophobic sentiments arose. Sounds familiar.
Yes.
And the exotic sort of for the dominant community, the Chinese became the targets. And so there were a lot of legislations that were introduced and passed that uh, aimed to kind of restrict the ability of Chinese people to fully exercise their civil rights. Asians by this time were restricted in many ways already, because beginning in 1790, when one of the very first legislation passed by Congress was a Naturalization Act, which stated that only people of white descent could be naturalized. So at the time, with the passage of that law, people from Africa or Asian, they could come as immigrants, but they could not be naturalized. Of course, African people were introduced as enslaved folks, but after the Civil War, that law was amended so people from Africa could be naturalized, but that right was not extended to people from Asia. So in late part of the 19th century, Asians, even though they could come and work, they were not able to vote because they were not naturalized citizens. So they had no leverage politically. And so, a Chinese person could be killed in a mine incident. And it was extremely difficult for a Chinese person to get fair hearing in a trial.
Yeah.
Um, and this kind of circumstances pervaded throughout the early part of the 20th century. And so a lot of Chinese after 1869, ended up leaving the country, but many could not leave, and these were basically stranded. And so Portland, First Christian Church of Portland took it upon themselves to minister to some of these Chinese people. So a mission was formed in that church. And that church, that mission eventually became a church. And in 1892, they actually hired a Chinese person who was educated at Drake College in Iowa, which, as back then was
Disciples related.
Disciple College. And he became the first Asian disciple minister, Zhu Hawk, Chinese man. And he served that church for 8 years. He was hired in 1892 faithfully, and the church did well under him. But he became physician while serving at the church by studying at Portland Medical College. And then after 1890, he went back to China. But his ministry was taken over by another Drake graduate named Louis Hugh, and so forth. So that community, not big numerically, because there really weren't a lot of Chinese folks to minister to at the time because of the depletion of the population and due to a lot of harassment. But the community that it attracted really found solace, meaning, support from this church, and that Portland First Christian Church in Portland. And I should not fail to mention the Christians Women's Board of Missions
Yes.
cooperate to establish and support.
Yes.
But things just didn't improve. And in 1924, a new law was passed. It's a new immigration law, Johnson-Reed Act, so-called. And this law basically categorically prevented Asians from coming to the United States to work. And of course, before this time, there were a number of other laws that were passed that went against the Asians that we all know about, the famous 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese people from coming to the States as laborers. And then there was another law passed in 1913. This was specific to California, Alien Land Law, which stated that aliens who live in California cannot own land, even if they work on it, because they're not qualified to become citizens. It really was a very manipulative way to just take away any opportunity for Asians to own property. And then a 1924 law, taking the idea from the Alien Land Law, it basically said any immigrant who is not eligible to become naturalized is barred from immigrating. So of course, by 1790 law, Asians were barred from becoming naturalized. So they were categorically shut out from immigration. So from 1924 and actually till about 1965, when a new immigration law was passed, Asians were basically shut out. There were some wiggle room at the end in the 50s, but yeah, so this was extremely harsh environment in which Asian Americans had to, make a living in the States. So going back to our churches, by 1924, when that law was passed, the community, had depleted, the members were not being replenished by new folks because there really weren't a whole lot of new folk. And it was extremely difficult for the mission board, by the time United Christian Missionary Society, to acquire leadership for this community, train leadership. So, and the record that we have, which was published actually in the World Call, which was the leading disciple journal of the time, stated that the advisory board in Portland that oversaw this community decided in 1923 that it really wasn't worth putting any more investment into this community because it really wasn't going anywhere. So they decided to close the church in 1924.
But this was,
But
I just want to underline here that this was all kind of externally imposed on the church by these conditions that had been created by these incredibly restrictive laws on the state and then the federal level.
exactly. And of course, in the announcements, those sorts of conditions are not talked about, but in more informal missionary uh, communications, that's identified. One prominent missionary executive identifies the real reason behind all this is racial prejudice against people of Asian descent, specifically Chinese. That simply made it impossible for these communities to thrive. And so the Chinese church was closed in 1924. In the same year, another very important Chinese disciple institution, San Francisco Chinese Institute, was closed as well. And so this was one instance in which racism directly affected Chinese Asian disciple community. Another instance is probably something that is more well known among us because of its national implications, which was the Japanese American internment. And there were Japanese disciples who also were interned. We all know how this happened, right? In December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed. And in the following year, in February, President Delano Roosevelt gave his executive order 9066, which stated that the Secretary of War would have authority to make certain laws about people living in areas that he deemed vulnerable. So what the Secretary of War did was to move suspicious elements from areas that he thought would be vulnerable to the United States and move them in places that he thought was safer. So what it basically meant was relocating about 120,000 Americans of Asian descent from Pacific West Coast to inner Western region in one of 10 numerous camps throughout the Western regions. And by that time, the disciples had 5 church communities that were Japanese, and one of them was not affected by it, but 4 was. The one that was not affected was because of its location. It was already in far west in Colorado, on the Arizona Valley area. Arkansas Valley area. But all the other 4 were in, Western shore region, like one in LA, one in San Bernardino, one in Imperial Valley, and there's another one in Berkeley. And these churches were all closed. And the one in LA in particular was really extremely agonizing incident, because that Japanese church, which was founded in about 1900 in Los Angeles among Japanese bachelors who were working and studying in LA, grew up to be a very thriving Japanese church, center of Japanese Americans. And there are a lot, even today, but back then in particular, Japanese were not Christian. They were Buddhists, Shintoists. So there weren't a whole lot of Japanese Protestants to begin with. But this church really thrived and became the largest Japanese Protestant church in the entire country, with having about 200 members in its community, and officials from Japan would come to kind of study it to
Wow.
figure out how this community worked. So this was a very distinguished church in our midst in Los Angeles. But that didn't matter, And when the internment order came, all those people had to drop everything and leave. And that church, Japanese Christian church in LA, was converted into All People's Church and Center by the United Christian Missionary Society. And when the war ended in 45 and those Japanese church members returned, conflict ensued because because first generation Japanese Americans in particular wanted their church back. But by that time, this ministry was ongoing and doing very well on its own. And actually, All People's Church and Center really was a extremely innovative ministry back then, focused on diverse racial groups and urban ministry.
Right.
Dan Gong, who was doing it, was really exceptional ministry. So it really was a horrible situation of these two communities that really had served the needs of communities, other communities, but having to kind of conflict. So finally, what happened was the United Christian community decided to fund the first generation Japanese disciples, their desire to have their own distinct Japanese language community. So in 1950, they established a church called the West Adams Christian Church. And this again became a very thriving Japanese community of disciples, and it did very well throughout the second half of the 20th century. It closed, unfortunately, though, in 2010 for a number of reasons. One of the reasons being highway number 5 going right through their area and causing all the members to move elsewhere, that sort of thing. Yep. But going back to the earlier part of this episode, obviously the internment, we all know by now that there really was no evidence whatsoever ever to suspect the Japanese Americans of being in collusion with the Japanese Empire to undermine the United States, right? Yeah. And there were thousands of Japanese residents in Hawaii, most of whom were not interned because everybody in Hawaii knew Japanese were loyal. 40% of the population was Japanese, right? So it really, it didn't make any sense. If you were gonna constrain Japanese people because you suspected them, though, you would probably be constraining Japanese living in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor was located.
Yes, I know.
They didn't do any of the only, very small portion of the Japanese living in Hawaii were imprisoned or incarcerated. So this just was very horrible and nonsensical glitch, not a glitch, a huge mistake and painful part of our history. And we all suffered because of it. And we, disciples, through the hardships and sufferings of our disciple Japanese churches, experienced that as well. So yeah, absolutely. These two incidents, I think, very highly highlight how racism has impacted our communities.
Yeah, and I mean, I really appreciate your putting all of this in the larger social, economic, and political context. I often hear people say, well, you can't you can't let politics into the church. political decisions that were made come into the church, whether the church likes it or not.
Absolutely.
And this certainly has been the case with Asian American disciples and their historical experience. I mean, decisions made in the State House in California or in the halls of Congress had a greater impact on the success or failure of our churches than just kind of anything. I mean, it just you have to we have to talk about this stuff. We have to address it. Sometimes I'm a Bible scholar, and when people say you can't politicize the gospel, I say the gospel is inherently political. I mean, it's what Jesus got crucified by Rome for a reason. What he was saying and what he was doing was a threat to their imperial economic power, and it's just no accident that they reserve the cruelest form of public execution for Jesus. Because he was a political threat. He was an economic threat. So anyhow, politics and economics come into the life of the church, whether we like it or not. And I think that we have to address it head on. And certainly this really destructive, economically based ideology of white supremacy that has had such a terrible impact on so many of our own community, and is something that we have to address forthrightly. We've taken a lot of time and covered a lot of territory, but I do, before I just release you, and with our deepest gratitude, ask if there are particular people or landmark moments that you would like to just highlight for us before we conclude our podcast.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunities. Certainly, Drew Hawk, I already mentioned, is an important person. He was the first Asian American, for a while anyway, before he returned to China,
Right.
pastor. And when he went back to China, he served both as a physician and pastor within the Stone Campbell framework. So he was faithful till the end. I talked a whole lot about the first stream of the history, so I should probably speak a bit more about the second stream, which happened in 1978 and afterward. And I already mentioned Harold Johnson,
Right.
David Kagiwara, Sungu Choi. These were three really kind of, in NAPAC, we call the founders of our NAPAC community. They really worked very hard to deliberately bring together this disparate Asian presence within the denomination into one cohesive community. And in 1980, NAPAC's first convocation took place. And then, so at the time, David Kagiwara became the first convener. And that from that point onward, these leaders worked deliberately. And I also should add, there were a lot of people from within the leadership of the mainstream discipledom who were extremely sympathetic to the efforts of these leaders, Harold Johnson, Sungu Choi, and David Kagiwara. And so that has to be taken into consideration. This, after all, was in the 70s when the entire country, progressive Christians in particular were greatly influenced by the civil rights movement. In 1972, our own denomination finally, established its first reconciliation ministry, right? And so in 1984, our denomination formally is designated AAD at the time, which became NAPAD, as official constituent of the denomination. The general board did that in its meeting in 1984, and that was, a turning point because it allowed us to tap into the resources of the denomination, personnel as well as financial, and then that allowed disciple home missions to work with these leaders to found a position within DHM for ministry focused on Asian Americans. And that finally led to the establishment of the office of the executive at the time, executive associate pastor for Asian American ministries. And the Guni Yu was chosen to fill that position in February of 1992. And Guni served in that position, as you know, Rick, in an excellent way throughout
Yes.
his tenure. He retired in 2010. And through his work, churches grew, and our presence within the denomination, our ability to contribute to the denomination, because we are not large, but we have some I would say many
Yes.
capable people that
Yes.
can make all sorts of contributions.
Yes.
That eventually led to a series of other movements within the denomination, which eventuated. In particular, I should mention Dr. Sharon Watkins when she became general minister and president in 2005. She, like her predecessor, Richard Ham, took a very strong interest in the APAD and worked with us. And it was through her effort that you mentioned in Mission Coordinating Council that was formed in 2008 that eventually led to I would say, promotion of NAPAD within DHM to a kind of independent general unit, which became a reality in 2010 with its distinct, board of directors. Now, you see NAPAD alongside Abra Hispana and National Convocation as part of the larger unit of the disciples community. So NAPAD, like Convocation and Abra Hispana, is for all disciples, not
Right.
just for its constituents.
Right.
Yeah.
I have with my wife Sharon Watkins, whom I just love. I loved her as general minister and president, and just generally. We have spent just some of our favorite times have been at NAPAD culture nights, which have just been amazing at various gatherings of the church. So the NAPAD community has made such an enormous contribution to the life of the whole church, and continues to do so, not only through folks like Dr. Timothy Lee, but there just are countless people from the NAPAD community who have offered significant leadership in our church, and we are so blessed as a whole church. Is there anything else, Tim, that you would like to lift up or say finally before we wrap this thing up?
Well, I will just express my gratitude again for invitation to this program, and I want to thank the disciples for clinging to its vision of oneness in the midst of the fragmentation. And I really think it's important that we press on that vision and not give up especially when it's so tempting to do so, because that's our calling. Like the Presbyterians, they praise the glory of God, and we do that too. But we kind of let them lead on that path, right? And the Methodists, they do holiness. We do holiness too, but we are willing to follow the Methodists in our holiness, right? We don't compete against them. We know they're good at that. So we let them lead and we follow. What we do as well, if not more or better than anybody else, is bringing unity to our Christian churches. This is what we do and what we do best in leading. And we really, things get tough sometimes, but really have to focus our minds and our efforts and resources on this and press on. Yeah.
Amen. What a wonderful sermon and evangelical prophetic call to the church. Oh, I have just so enjoyed this conversation, Tim. And we love you and appreciate your enormous contribution to our church. And I want to thank you for agreeing to be part of this Disciples History podcast. God's blessings to you, and God's blessings to all of you out there who are listening to this podcast. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you, everybody. God bless.
God bless.